In 1995, Europe was the scene of genocide. The bodies who lie here are the victims of the greatest atrocity on European soil since the Holocaust. More than 8,000 men and boys were hunted down, murdered and buried in mass graves. Their remains are still being found today. 25 years on, the survivors and eyewitnesses who speak of the genocide risk being unheard.
Srebrenica je bila jako lijep grad, mali grad, ali je bio pun života, To je bila jedna mala oaza. Čak je mirisala, svaka je kuća imala svoju terasu prepunu cvijeća. Po danas da sam ostala bez ikoga, bez oba dvoje djece, bez muža. Oprostite, suza mi je izdajica, nikad ne bi to uradila, ali mogu pričati o svemu, ali kad dođe do djece da pričam o djeci, zaista mi bude tada najteže.
Bosnia and Herzegovina, one of the world's great crossroads, a melting pot of cultures and identities. All eyes were on this country in 1984 as it hosted the Winter Olympic Games. Within 10 years, the world's eyes would be turned back on Bosnia, but for different reasons. On the ashes of the former Yugoslavia, leaders exploiting identity politics rose to power across the region. Ultra-nationalist forces planned to create a greater Serbia, filled only with ethnically pure Serbs. This meant Bosnian Muslims were cleansed from the land. Serb forces, the most powerful military in the region, swept across Bosnia, sending people fleeing from villages in the north and east to concentration camps and slaughtering thousands of others. This was a battle of empire expansion, portrayed as a battle of faith and ethnicity. By 1995, Bosnian Serb forces had taken nearly every village in eastern Bosnia and flushed them of Muslims. Srebrenica was one of only a few UN safe areas in the region, and tens of thousands of refugees poured in. On July 11th, Srebrenica fell. As he entered the town, General Ratko Mladic spoke to Serb cameras.
Evo nas 11. jula 1995. godine u srpskoj Srebrenici. Uoči još jednog velikog praznika srpskoga, poklanjamo srpskom narodu ovaj grad i napokon došao je trenutak da se posle bune protiv Dahija Turcima osvetimo na ovom prostoru.
As the Serbs moved in, women and children gathered around the UN base at Potocari. But men and boys like Hassan were worried about how the Serbs would treat them and made for the woods.
In July 1995, I lost my father and my twin brother. I tried to escape from Srebrenica through the forests alongside with them, but unfortunately I am the only one who survived. It took me 6 days and 6 nights to reach Tuzla. It was a real suffering. I did not have anything to eat. I was being hunted like an animal.
The few hundred Dutch peacekeepers at the base, waiting for UN backup that never came, handed over their weapons and the men and the boys to the Serbs. For those men and the men who had tried to escape, this was the beginning of the single most horrific week of slaughter in recent history.
They promised that we would not be killed and that we would be treated according to all the Geneva Conventions.
The thousands of men and boys captured were then loaded onto trucks and taken to execution sites.
I noticed the rows and rows of dead bodies in front of me, and I don't know when I was shot. I just remember later that I was lying on my stomach, that I was shivering and trembling. One of the soldiers said to the other to check all the bodies, but he refused. He said they are already dead and left the place. I never could imagine that I could survive at that moment. I just waited to die because I lost so much blood. Someone was moving in front of me and it was other survivor, and I asked him, "Are you alive? Are you alive?" He said, "Yes, yes. Come and untie me, please." We hid everywhere, in the streams, in graveyards, in destroyed houses and forests, because Serb soldiers were patrolling. They collected the dead bodies and put them on the vehicles, and they took them to a mass grave. And it was a horrific scene at that moment for me.
Hasan Hasanovic, a survivor of the genocide, is one of the guides at the Memorial Centre just a few miles north of Srebrenica and home to the former UN peacekeeper base.
I survived to tell the story of Srebrenica genocide. It's very important that people know what happened in Srebrenica, that we educate young generations to make sure that similar thing does not happen ever again.
2010. godine sam ukopala oba dvoje djece i muža. Mog starijeg sina sam ukopala samo 2 koste od nogu, tako isto i od muža. Mali sin, rekli su mi da je kompletno tijelo, sam ne ima lijeve ruke, pola malog prsta.
25 years on, the survivors of Srebrenica are still fighting to have their voices heard. The strength of survivors in sharing their stories and fighting for justice inspires us to take action. Join us at Remembering Srebrenica and pledge this year to stand up to intolerance and hatred, to raise awareness of the Bosnian genocide, and to make every action matter.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello everyone to another episode of Justice for All Now. This is your host, Hannah Zaberi. Thank you for joining us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused TV network. You can always watch us 24/7 on Galaxy 19, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, and soon Apple TV. Bosnian Muslims are marking 25 years since the Srebrenica genocide, the worst atrocity on European soil since the end of the Second World War. With the memorial ceremony sharply reduced due to the coronavirus pandemic. The event marks July 11th, 1995, the day when Bosnian Serb forces marched into the town of Srebrenica, a Muslim enclave on Serb territory in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that has been under the UN protection. After capturing it, the ill-fated town Serb forces systematically killed more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys over the course of around 4 days. You just watched a short video commemorating 25 years and giving testimony by victims. To discuss all this today, I have, and excuse me, I'm not, it's not easy to do anti-genocide work. And it's not easy every day to see this playing out still across the world. Every day in Burma, in East Turkestan, in Rwanda, in Nigeria, we see killings of these sorts committed over and over again when the world had committed to never again. Joining us today for this show and to talk about why it is so important to remember the Bosnian genocide, to remember what occurred, what happened, is Amil Khan. Amil is the director of Remembering Srebrenica, UK. He first joined the organization in 2015 as a key member of the team that delivered the UK 20th anniversary commemoration as at Westminster Abbey. He's responsible for the operational management and delivery of the organization's work. This is a charitable organization that raises awareness of the Bosnian genocide and organizes the UK National Srebrenica Memorial Day. So thank you so much for joining us today, Amil. It's great to have you here, and it's so important for our next generations to remember the Bosnian genocide. And welcome to the show.
Assalamu alaikum to you, Hannah, and to all your viewers. And thank you for having me on for what is obviously a very important anniversary, as you quite rightly pointed out.
Please tell us a little bit more about yourself. How did you get involved with this work? How long, you joined in 2015. Please share more about the organization that you work for.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the director of Remembering Srebrenica UK, and we were established in 2013. And in the last 7 years, we've organised close to 7,500 memorial events and activities right across the UK. And these are held in local town halls, schools, places of worship, from mosques, synagogues and churches to community centres to police forces and constabularies. We've also educated 100,000 young people on the lessons from Srebrenica, and we've created 1,450 community champions who pledge to stand up to hatred and intolerance in their communities. So we've taken out nearly 1,500 British citizens to Srebrenica, where they've had the chance to meet with some of the survivors you saw in the video, to better understand what happened in Bosnia, and they then return using their knowledge to pledge to do something to raise awareness. In terms of my personal involvement, like many of you viewers who will be watching this evening, I remember having a vague recollection of what was happening in Bosnia. And what I'm about to talk about, you can actually say to things happening in the world right now. We see what's happening, we have some understanding of what's going on, but there really isn't anything more beyond that. And when this opportunity first arose in 2015, I remember thinking I vaguely remember some of the images on the screen. However, I didn't know that much about it. And I decided to get involved. And when I did, and I had the opportunity to visit Bosnia for the very first time in 2015, it just left an indelible impression upon me. I went there feeling a sense of great sorrow and sadness that something as horrific as an act of genocide could have taken place so recently. I left with a deep sense of apprehension that if something like this can happen so recently, so close to home, why can it never happen again? Because that's often what we say. After the Holocaust, we said never again, but the sad reality is that genocide's taken place in different continents, in different decades, time and time again. And more importantly, I felt a sense of moral obligation and responsibility that actually, having seen what I did and having heard from some of the survivors, and particularly the mothers, many of whom have lost their husbands, their sons, their brothers, male relatives on such a scale that actually many of them have no longer any middle-aged men in their families. I thought the very least I could do, having listened to their stories and bear witness to that, is come back to the UK and do whatever I could to try and raise awareness, to try and ensure that those stories that you've just heard continue to get heard by people who don't know anything about it, and more importantly, that when we say never again, we mean it, and to use the lessons of what happened in Bosnia to try and educate others here so we can address some of the forces of hatred and intolerance that can lead to something as horrific as a genocide taking place.
And I want to talk about some of those lessons that you guys teach youth. Before that, let's, if you don't mind, if you would take us back to July 6, 1995, when the offensive first started, and when Bosnian Serb forces advanced through the south and burnt Bosniak homes along the way. Could you share with us what events led up to this offensive, and what kind of sentiments were culminating that would lead to such an event?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So in 1995, in July the 6th, and you saw that in the video, you had Bosnian Serb forces entering the town, and General Ratko Mladic saying there that he is, he used the word in a derogatory sense, but referring to the Bosnian Muslims as Turks and citing something going back to the Ottoman Empire, way back, sort of in the the early 14th century, justification for some reason as to what they were going to do. However, Hannah, genocide doesn't happen overnight. What you saw was the culmination of procedural steps that started 3 years ago. And as early as 1992, people will remember Time magazine had a very vivid image of someone called Frikat Alic who's being held in a concentration camp. And that's where it all started. The ethnic cleansing started much sooner before that. But even before the ethnic cleansing, it started with rhetoric around words, creating this mentality of them versus us, dehumanizing another group. In the case of Bosnian Muslims, we saw they were being singled out. So, for example, in a region called Prijedor, which is in northwest Bosnia, they were told to wear white armbands to try and identify themselves from the rest of the population. Many Bosnian Muslims in jobs of seniority, such as in the judiciary, were forcibly removed. And you have them being separated and held in concentration camps. And this was all fueled by very divisive rhetoric, as I said, but also a level of hatred that was allowed to manifest itself to the extent that there became a belief that the only way they could achieve, the Bosnian Serbs could achieve what they wanted to do, which is create an ethnically pure Serbia, was to completely wipe out the Bosnian Muslim population. So in July 1995, that doesn't happen overnight. That was the series of carefully planned steps that had been taken, which you saw starting with dehumanization and symbolization and classification with them versus us. And that eventually led to over 8,000 Muslim men and boys being killed in the space of just a few days in Bosnia. And I mean, the tragic thing about Srebrenica is many people had actually gone there because, as the video points out, it was a UN safe area. And they had fled there in the hope that they would be protected, that actually no harm could have happened to them by being there. And unfortunately, that proved not to be the case. And the sheer scale of the number of people who were killed, and not just killed, the way they were killed, the fact that they were dumped in mass graves and later buried in secondary and sometimes tertiary graves to conceal the crimes, what happened, was something that just sounds extraordinary, because what we're talking about did not happen. We're talking about, decades ago. It happened just in 1995.
I know. I was in college then, and it just seems, and for you, like you were saying, this happened on your continent, so it's so much closer to home. And so you're not Bosniak yourself, but you feel a responsibility to share these lessons with your country, with your community. And I would love to talk more about those lessons. What lessons have you guys gleaned from this genocide?
Yeah, I mean, the first, which I've mentioned, is that in essence, genocide doesn't happen overnight. So genocide should be seen, a model as 10 steps to genocide, and genocide is the 9th step, the 10th being denial. But how it starts off is actually with words. I think the lessons we try to convey to communities in the United Kingdom is that we have to be vigilant against the forces of hatred that can lead people to harbor such sentiments to such an extent that visceral hatred turns neighbor on neighbor, turns communities against each other. And so when people say, well, actually, it happened then and it could have happened now, or it happened in that country, but it would never happen here. One of the things that you cannot take that for granted, because Bosnia was one of the most integrated societies that you could ever wish to find. It hosted the Winter Olympics just 8 years beforehand. And actually, if you go to Bosnia, it's very difficult for those on the outside to be able to distinguish between those who are Bosnian Muslims, who are Bosnian Serbs, or who are Croats. And what we say is the lessons is that ultimately we all have a responsibility that where we see low levels of hatred manifesting itself, not to be a bystander, but to stand up to that hatred. And we're talking about not just, you and I having that responsibility, but like that civic responsibility that extends to some people in positions of influence, for example, because it's not just them challenging such hatred, but they also have responsibility not to propagate, because we've seen, and we're seeing in the Western world in particular, that there is a lot of concern about the levels of increasing hate crime. And we have seen people in positions of responsibility adding fuel to the fire by saying things or failing to do things, which have actually allowed such sentiments to escalate and create some of the divisions in our communities.
So when those messages come back, now, how large is the Bosnian population in the UK itself?
Yeah, so we have a diaspora population is around sort of 10,000,
Mm-hmm.
and they are based in certain areas right across in England in particular, but we have a large Bosnian population up in Scotland. And one of the things that they say to us is that because they know better than anyone else where hatred and division can lead to,
Mm-hmm.
they understand more than anyone else why it's important that when I'm talking about learning the lessons, that it's not just empty words, but it's backed up by action.
Mm-hmm.
And they are also one of the most powerful individuals we have because, as I said, we organize quite a lot of memorial events and activities.
Mm-hmm.
And they provide some of the most powerful testimony because when people have the chance to hear from someone who came as refugees, you just take that as an example. Sometimes there's a lot of negative stereotypes about refugees and whether we should take them or not. But when you hear from them, none of them actually chose to be a refugee. They became a refugee overnight for no choice of their own, having to actually flee for their own safety. And when they share their stories about how difficult it was for them, when they share their stories, I can just give you one example, is that in the UK, quite often when a Bosnian meets another Bosnian for the first time, the first thing they will ask is, how many relatives did you lose during the Bosnian War?
Also.
And that's just something, because they're just so used to it. It's just a question they ask because they will have at least a number of relatives that they know and were related to that were killed. And for me, that's just a striking thing, is that I was just reminded of it last week when I introduced one to the other. And she just told me she met someone who lost 36 male relatives in her family. And they just bonded over that because they had that not just that shared history, but that shared pain, which they're still continuing to suffer from 25 years later.
So how do you reflect, one of the part of this weekend, there was a lot of work done, and I know you all were very busy. What were some of the activities that you did, especially under COVID, to reflect on the 25 years since the genocide? And then I would like to sort of, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but really wanted to, focus on the rise of Islamophobia, the Islamophobic sentiment in Europe, as well as across the world, in India, in Burma. We see Islamophobia being used, and that sentiment rising to such a degree where actions are being taken against entire populations. So yes, so first let's start about if you could tell us what all was done this weekend to commemorate 25 years.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, the outbreak of COVID-19 meant we had to change our plans with sort of less than 100 days to go, because we had originally planned to hold a very large service at St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the UK's most iconic institutions. But that had to be postponed. However, we were determined to ensure that we were still able to honour the victims who died in the genocide, and make sure that we didn't allow this important anniversary year to go by without ensuring that actually we would commemorate. So we had an emphasis was very much on doing things online in a way that respected the social distancing that was in place and did not put in jeopardy the welfare and safety of anyone. So our Srebrenica Memorial Day commemoration this year was delivered entirely online, and it featured a number of contributions, not only from the survivors, but also from distinguished figures from both the UK and the United States. So we had His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, spoke at our commemoration, as did the Prime Minister. From the United States, we had President Clinton, who actually opened the Potachari Memorial Center back in 2003, and of course was US President when the war was brought to an end with the signing of the Dayton Agreement. And we also had a special message from Angelina Jolie, who's done a lot of work in Bosnia as a UN representative, particularly focusing on how sexual violence is used in conflict. So our commemoration was delivered entirely online, and we thought, while we physically can't bring people together, this presented a wonderful opportunity to actually reach out to so many people, both in the UK and also abroad, from the comfort of their own homes, that they could be part of that commemoration to honour the victims and to remember. And in general, I was overwhelmed by the number. I think we're still doing a calculation of how many activities we think took place, but it could be as much as 2,000. and people just doing something very small, as incorporating the lessons of Srebrenica into their prayer, if there was a faith institution. We've had so many people in the community tweet pictures of what they did to try and mark and remember. So it was fantastic to see so many people show innovation to ensure they were able to commemorate this year. I mean, to answer your question, it is increasingly worrying to see what's happening in terms of the rise of Islamophobia, to see what's happening in many parts of the world, which has all the hallmarks. If you look actually, and I go back to what I said, the stages of genocide. You know, when you think about what happened in Srebrenica, and this is why it's important to commemorate, because we talk about the lessons, but if we are to truly learn the lessons of Srebrenica, we need to be able to identify and, more important, intervene to prevent those things from happening again. Because the sad reality is, Anna, you can see some of the things I've described to you and some of the things that you saw in that video happening again.
Again, exactly.
And we can see it. And we almost, it's as if like history is repeating itself, because the question then follows is what can be done to prevent it from happening? What will individuals, or what will governments, or what will states do to try and actually do something to prevent something that many people are warning us about will happen? And for me, it's just heartbreaking, because I work very closely in this area. And when you see what's happening, and when you see, particularly with the rhetoric, because that's how it starts, with some of the sentiments not being challenged, and in some respects, people feeding into that narrative, which is very difficult for minority communities to defend themselves from. It's, for me, something which I find to be very concerning, and actually why it redoubles my own determination and our organization's commitment to actually never stop what we're doing, because many people may say, 25 years ago, 30 right that you want to commemorate, but what relevance does it have for the future? And I just point out what's happening across the world actually has absolutely every relevance, because until we reach a stage where actually this stops, then we must continue to do what it is that we are doing.
And this is so important. We're getting messages from Rohingya audience who are congratulating Bosnians because their genocide ended, and the Rohingya genocide is still taking place. There's another message on the screen: "Save Rohingya, stop genocide." And this is, this is global, and the survivors of these genocides. Perhaps this is something that perhaps we can work together as sort of maybe introducing them to each other, because this, as you were saying, the steps are the same, the results are the same. We have, for example, one of our colleagues in the Save Uyghur campaign, she has 90 relatives missing, 90 relatives. She keeps an Excel sheet that they have not been in touch with because they have been put into the concentration camps in East Turkestan, occupied by China. So it's so important, as you were saying, to commemorate these days, to let people know that we, because when people, and one of the things that I found very troubling was here, I saw on young Muslim Twitter, especially American Muslim Twitter, that a lot of young people don't know about Bosnia. They don't know what happened. It was before some of them weren't born at that time, or they might have been toddlers. And so this is so important to keep highlighting. Now, one of the things that you talked about was Angelina Jolie, and this goes back to a question about the United Nations. What was the role that the UN played? And, what happened after the initial offensive attack? And what ways was perhaps the United Nations manipulated in the development of this genocide?
Yeah, when you go to Bosnia, there's a very powerful photo in a gallery. And it says UN, United Nations, but united nothing. I think Bosnians felt very let down because the United Nations had a responsibility to protect them, and they failed to do so. And I think in terms of the stain on the reputation of the United Nations, which was later recognized by the Secretary General Kofi Annan, who admitted that actually they should have done more to prevent what happened in Srebrenica. And Srebrenica is not just a stain on the conscience of the world, but also in terms of the United Nations, because there were repeated warnings as to what would happen. But there was a complete lack of willingness on behalf of the UN to do anything to prevent that. So the feelings towards the UN is one of, you can quite rightly understand, is that people were led to believe when you had peacekeepers being placed there that actually no harm could be done to them.
Mhm.
Actually, when they were first deployed in Srebrenica, if you look at some of the scenes, there were scenes of jubilation because they were told nothing would happen to them. They felt a sense of reassurance and security, as you would do, thinking that by having the UN, that nothing could happen. But the fact is, they did stand idly by, which they later recognized, because ultimately those 8,000 deaths could have been prevented.
Exactly.
And I mean, I use, the figure we have is 8,372, but behind that number is a name. And behind that name is someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father.
Mhm.
And that's someone who a family member will never get back. And that's someone for every day of their life, they will continue to remember that particular victim. So when we talk about these things in terms of the failure of the United Nations, it isn't in terms of like an abstract policy discussion that something may happen. It's not in terms of like economics. A failure to intervene may lead to the economy doing this or whatever. These are people's lives we're talking about.
Okay.
I think in that sense, there is, certainly for the UN, I think there was, on their part was a massive failure. And I also think it led to a reflection as to what role that the UN plays, but I think the wide international community, because ultimately, there's only certain groups that can stop things from happening. But in order to do so, you need to have a consensus, and you need to have, more importantly, the willingness to show that moral responsibility to recognize that the part you have in the world to do so.
And this is something so troubling, because we're seeing it again, that the United Nations is again with that same hesitancy, again with the same. In fact, the Human Rights Council now has countries that are severe, gross human rights violations on their own records, and they're monitoring what others around the world are doing. So this is, I mean, at times in circles that we do, like a lot of survivors ask us, like, what other mechanisms can there be in the world? Why didn't anybody come to stop this? Why does it keep continuing? And those are very hard questions to answer. I also wanted to talk about, as we were watching in the video, that this was a very gendered genocide. The men and boys were treated very differently than the women. And so if you could comment perhaps on that, is what was some of the differences what happened to the men and boys versus the women and children?
Yeah, so as you saw in the clip, women and children were separated, and sort of the men were placed on buses and later taken to what would turn out to be the sites of execution. However, in terms of what happened to women, there were, and I mean, the estimates vary because, we may never know the true figure because of the stigma attached to it. But we know actually, and in particular, at the start of the war, is that women were being raped by Bosnian Serb forces, and some of them were horrific cases that you hear about. Some of them were very young girls. Some of these crimes were taking place in front of like a mother, forcibly having to watch what was happening to her daughter. So when we talk about what happened in the Bosnian War, and sometimes that's often, not highlighted, and it's really important to do so, is that you saw what happened in terms of the men who were killed in the genocide. But in terms of the women, it was a different form of hatred they were subjected to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite perverse because, and I've worked a lot in this area, and we actually dedicated an entire year in 2017 on gender and genocide, focused on this. Whereas in essence, it was creating this ethnically pure state, and it involves, the Bosnian Serb forces, the men trying to assert their supremacy over the women by trying to use, sexual violence to try and assert and make a statement. So yeah, I mean, it was horrific. People, whether you were male or female, no matter how old you were either, no one was spared in terms of what happened during the Bosnian War. I think not just during the war, but afterwards, Hannah, when you consider actually those who've had to fight for justice have been the women, those who've had to rebuild their lives after everything that they've gone through, when they wouldn't want anything else but to forget what happened to them as individuals and what happened to them as their family. They've had to actually rebuild their lives and try and get on with their lives. They've had to try and bring up some of their young children. They, to this day, have to continue to fight for justice in bringing the perpetrators, ensuring they're held to account. And more importantly, there's denial of this genocide, which is still prevalent. And they are the ones who are having to constantly ensure that actually those who are denying are not placed in a position where their views can become any more mainstream. They're fighting against it. They're going to the court every time someone is placed there. So it's not just the suffering that they had to go through during the war, it's afterwards what they continue to go through and all the fighting that they've had to, because quite often they were the only ones left in their family in order to do all this.
I want to talk a little bit about this denial. And this is one of the 10 stages of genocide. Denial is the very final stage. And it's rising. We see reports of that now, even in mainstream media, where it's being called a unfortunate incident that took place instead of what actually took place. So can you talk a little bit about what sort of denial are you seeing currently in Europe?
Yeah, so if you take what happened in Srebrenica, so denial is refusing to call it a genocide. So it is a genocide, and it's been ruled by 2 international courts that it's a genocide, and that terminology means a lot to those people, because for them it basically confirms what happened. But there are those who continue to actually it's not a genocide, and they give many reasons as to why it's the case. They say there were aggressors on both sides, they were defending themselves. There are those who actually question the figure and say actually not that many people died. And you can just imagine how hurtful it is for a survivor to be told that actually he or she did not have a husband, sons, or brother, that they simply didn't exist. We've had, particularly in Bosnia and Bosnian Serbs in Republika Srpska, which is an entity that was created. But they are actually establishing commissions that challenge whether it was a genocide. So this is very important, is that basically 35 years on, there are still people who refuse to accept what happened. There are still people who refuse to accept the full extent and the full responsibility of the crimes that were committed. And until you can have that acknowledgement, you cannot have reconciliation. And it continues to be a major impediment to reconciliation, because you have to accept that what happened was a genocide, that those crimes were committed. And you mentioned, social media allows such theories to, in essence, just multiply. You have a proliferation of conspiracy theories, someone putting out a video, and that can be retweeted, and that can be shared, and that can just add to the discourse that feeds in to this whole denial. And that's one of the challenges that we face, I think, in 2020, is because this is a fast developing and fast evolving tool that people have at their disposal. You can call it, I know in the United States, but they talk about alternative facts. Well, these are people trying to put forward what their alternative facts are. And one of the strongest ways we can rebut those deniers is to continue to do what we do, is to continue to share those stories, is to continue to commemorate, and more importantly, to continue to educate. Because if we're not doing that, then there's a real danger that genocide denial can become very prevalent and can gain far more traction, which will be very worrying.
And yes, there's use of bots, there's use of, it's not just real human beings who are spreading this. It's actually use of technology to deny. And this is something that we're seeing. We've been seeing how Facebook and WhatsApp is being used to organize genocide right now. And now we're seeing the same tools being used to deny when genocide has taken place, when these tools didn't even exist at that time. So this is, and it's very, very important for those of us, like some people will ask, like, what's the use? Like, what are Twitter storms? Why do you have them? Or why do you need to, put a hashtag up? Or it's because of this, that the people who want this to be wiped out from communal memory are many more than people who want to remember, it seems, because of these bots, because it makes it look like there are many more of them. So this is something that we really need to keep an eye on. And I want to, like, you talked about crimes, and this is something else that a lot of young people who may be watching this don't realize what sort of crimes took place. So please share with us where were the execution sites that Bosniak men and boys were sent to? How did they choose who gets sent? And how did they transport so many to these sites? Who was involved in these executions?
Yeah, and this is the sad thing, really, because in terms for genocide to be committed on such a scale, is the number of people who were participating were actually what you could call ordinary people. Because sometimes I talked about dehumanization earlier. When you have people commit such evil acts, we tend to separate them from the rest of humanity because their crimes on such a scale that we cannot conceive that someone like you and I would have the capacity to commit these crimes.
Mm.
And the sad thing is that these crimes were committed by people who were like some of friends with the victims. They used to live next door to them. They used to go to the same school as them. And then all of a sudden, things changed to such an extent is that they were holding a gun and carrying out these executions. And some of them were very young. You know, some of them were sort of in their early 20s.
Mm.
They were there committing acts of genocide. Some of the sites they were taken to were, for example, a school.
Mm.
The school was used as a place where people were being rounded up and executed. A warehouse was being used as a site of execution. So we know when we talk about some of these dark crimes, we just can't comprehend that it's just the normality at which it took place in places like this by people who were normal. And it was done on an industrial scale. You know, to kill 8,000 people in the space of just a few days was done with ruthless precision, almost callous precision. There were people were just treated and lined up and just taken and shot just like that and dumped. I mean, they're humans, and these are other humans who are committing these crimes. It's just really just even talking about it, you know, for me, it's something I still can't comprehend, even to this day.
And it's so important. Like, do you recommend people now? I mean, obviously, after the pandemic is over, travel to Bosnia and go see for themselves, because this is something else that a lot of people don't realize, that you can go visit. You can, a friend of mine always recommends, as even it's such a beautiful country, people should just go see it as a travel destination, but to go and visit so you can remember. Please talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things which, and it just shows you my perception because it had been shaped by what happened when I went to Bosnia. And to put into context how close Bosnia is just a 2-hour direct flight from the UK. I mean, in terms of like the United States, you know, that's shorter than many flights between some of your states, just put into context how close it is. And when you go there, the first thing which strikes you is what a beautiful country it really is. And this is what makes grappling with what happened there, because sometimes you associate it in happening in a place so far away, detached from what's similar to what we go through in terms of what we live in. And you see it's such a beautiful, picturesque country. It's going back to sort of Ottoman Empire that's reflected in its architecture and its culture. And when you go to Srebrenica itself, it's one of the most peaceful places you can see. You're surrounded by open space and trees. You can hear birds singing, which makes it quite eerie to try and think what was happening there just 25 years ago. So I would strongly urge anyone is that, you know, if they are in Europe, is to go to Bosnia, is to go to Srebrenica, is to go to Potocari, because in order to fully understand what happened, you really need to be there, and you really need to be in a position to bear witness and just to walk, for example, you know, thousands of tombstones, and you see thousands of names inscribed and the memorial, it really just hits home. And I think for me, and also for nearly 1,500 people we've taken from the UK, that's had such a profound impact on their life, on their outlook, that they've come back. And honestly, everyone says it's changed them for the rest of their life. And they just feel, as a consequence of going there, so determined to do whatever they can to raise awareness and to ensure that the stories are never forgotten, and that the pain and suffering, when you consider that actually to this day, you know, the victims are still suffering from what happened, the very least we can do is to ensure that actually our commitment to the cause never ends, just as their pain and suffering never ends.
I had a question that I wanted to ask you about this. So, regarding the Holocaust, Jewish people around the world have been very successful in making sure that the Holocaust is remembered throughout the world. It is in our textbooks, course books, wherever you may be around the world, except for some deniers as usual. But what can the Muslim community learn from the Jewish community when it comes to this? Because this was an anti-Muslim genocide. So, if you could comment on that, I'd really like to learn something from you.
But yeah, I mean, the UK is the only country that commemorates the genocide at a national level. And the advice I would give to people, and I think it stems from awareness really, because as you say, there's probably many Muslims who aren't aware of what happened in Bosnia. So I think the first stage is to try and increase awareness and understanding from all communities, including the Muslim community, so they can fully understand what happened, some of the similarities, with what's going on now, how it all starts. And once you do that, then you mobilize that, inevitably there will be so much passion and people saying, what can I do? And the second thing is you must mobilize that into constructive purpose, because that's exactly what we've done in the United Kingdom. Is remembering Srebrenica didn't come around because it was the initiative of the government choosing to do so. It was because we pushed for this to happen. And we started with one event, and then we used to have 20 events and 30 events. We're now having regularly up to 2,000 events and activities. In terms of local authorities, we used to have 2 or 3 across the United Kingdom. I think last week we have upwards of something like 150. So you have to recognize that actually it's an incremental process. But in order to do so, you need to have that awareness raising, because ultimately there still is the challenge is that not a lot of people know what happened in Srebrenica. Not a lot of people understand why it happened. And if you're able to achieve that and have that awareness raising, I think you're in a very strong position to do what we've done in the UK and to try and apply pressure wherever you may be, whether it's in the United States or Europe or Asia, to do something similar and make sure that the genocide is commemorated and that people are educated on it, and that we're using the lessons to inform what we do as communities to try and challenge hatred and intolerance.
Are there any books that you'd recommend for people to read? Are there, for example, just like that Diary of Anne Frank? It's something that when you read it, the Holocaust comes alive for you, or there are lots of movies made about this. Are there any books or movies, fiction, non-fictions, but especially fiction, that have been written about the Bosnian genocide?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of books actually, but I would say the most powerful thing to do actually, which distinguishes, just shows you how modern genocide is to listen to the testimony. Because the great thing about Anne Frank is when you read Anne Frank's diary, it comes from Anne Frank. And when you read the words on the pages, you can actually see and understand and empathize with her from her position. We don't have the concept of the diary now, but we have the concept of actually listening to some of those testimonies. I would encourage everyone to do what they're doing now. It just shows you just have to open your laptop, go on your phone, and you will find so much testimony. And I would say listen to it. Listen to people like you heard from Hatija, the mother in the video you showed earlier. You heard from Hassan, you heard from Nejad. Find their testimony. It's all online. Our website's a good starting point, but there's so much more. Listen to it and listen to it carefully. And that should be a very powerful starting point for you to say, actually, when I've heard that, I want to do something different to try and actually, in response to what I've heard, make a difference.
Definitely. And my last question as we're wrapping up this hour is, what work do you recommend other human rights organizations do to remember this genocide, but also to protect Muslim populations of other countries from experiencing such a tragedy again? How do we really dedicate ourselves to the cause of never again, especially right now? How do, you all have developed a lot of example collecting of the testimonies, this clip that we watched, the 7-minute short documentary we watched earlier. What what else can do you recommend other human rights organizations do? Because this is really important. Like as you suggested, event. We talked about the events and we talked about the commemoration, but I wanted to ask: are there any resolutions or bills or laws that people can put into work? That's the sort of like the vein I'm trying to address.
Absolutely, and what I would say is that, like with everything like that, it starts at grassroots level. And in order to get to that stage is like, in terms of like lobbying, and it doesn't matter like how small it may be, because sometimes you think actually my action doesn't matter, but like starting at a local level and grassroots and building your way up, because as you do so, you bring more people with you. And when you bring more people with you, you increase awareness. And when you increase awareness, people take note. And when people take note, that's the opportunity for you to try and influence what's happening. So I would say, yeah, absolutely. Go start locally, and it can be like with gathering people, influence your local legislator, for example, speak to them about the importance behind it, try and get them to then do something, which is what we done in the UK, for example, with members of parliament. And for example, we had on Saturday, for example, the British members of parliament, Srebrenica UK, which is our handle, was one of the top 3 used by them. And it shows you, because when we first started, there was very little people who were tweeting about it, but now it's really got onto the agenda. So I would say, look, start at a grassroots level. The second thing I would say is that you have to never give up. There will be setbacks. Sometimes you will actually question yourself, is that I'm trying as hard as I can, but I don't seem to be getting anywhere. You really can't. And if ever you are wavering in terms of your determination to do so, just remember the plight of those who are still suffering. And that will motivate you to carry on. And believe you me, you will get somewhere. You will make a breakthrough, and you will have to persevere. And when I say grassroots, it's not just legislators, but start with education. If there's like, in terms of like school boards, try and get them to do something. So actually it's on the curriculum. Try and influence other people in your community, because even in their places of work, if they're talking about these issues and they're mobilizing the interest, and that's how it all starts. Everything starts at grassroots level. And you see from there, it just has the potential to become so big. And that's when you're in the position to make the change that we all want to make.
Well, thank you so much, Amil, for being here and sharing your work with us. We're going to be commemorating the genocide throughout this week. This is extremely important to us, as Bosnia Task Force is and was a project of Justice for All. This is very close to the heart of our work. And we have learned so many lessons from that as we go on to anti-genocide work in other parts of the world. But this was a good reminder as well. What you just said is, a lot of times what we do is when the task force work is done, we sort of wrap the task force up, because we don't think that that the goal that was there to accomplish, we accomplished this goal and now we're moving on. But it's important to commemorate. So this is a lovely reminder in such a dark history that, that shining light on that darkness is so important. We cannot just turn our, forget about it, turn our, our eyes away and say, yes, we remember it in our heart. We have to remember it publicly too. So thank you so much. And thank you to all our audience for watching us. We're on Muslim Network TV 24/7. Assalamu alaikum.